He was already awake. There had never been a day in 150 years when Takashi Kageyama had overslept. To the day. He had purchased both Silas's and Rachel's old properties, along with 15 square miles of the dense Siberian forest surrounding them. The entire region had slowly transformed into a living sanctuary, not only for them, but for the largest population of Yakutian horses anywhere on earth. The horses roamed wild through the forest, their distant sounds ever present, a low and haunting murmur beneath the wind, like insects at night, always there if one listened. All of it, every path, planter, step, and wall, had been built from nephrite jade. The blocks used were not chosen for color, but for toughness and permanence. Each 6-foot cube had been transported one at a time, hundreds of miles, and cut from the dense, less desirable hues: green, yellow, brown, white. No two stones were alike, but together they blended harmoniously. The complex itself was a mansion, made entirely of jade, walls, platforms, and floors built from these massive blocks and polished jade slabs. It contained every feature of a modern home: lighting, electricity, warmth, but had none of the fragility of a traditional structure. It was meant to last as long as the planet. The transport of those blocks had been on the news for years, non-stop convoys of trucks, most carrying only a single stone at a time. The inner 3 miles of the forest was Kageyama's private estate, which included both Rachel's and Silas's original houses, preserved and untouched within the sanctuary. Beyond that, the remaining 12 miles were encircled by a 6-foot stone wall, built not for people, but for the horses. Even after all that had happened, the region attracted fewer visitors than one might expect. It was remote, quiet. Tourists tended to remain near the first few miles. The story of Rachel and Silas, their deaths, the grave, kept most others away. Kageyama had never been feared, only respected. But the boundary was rarely crossed. Kageyama had not moved in an hour. He was seated upright, spine perfectly straight, in the center of a jade-walled room. The floor beneath him was seamless stone, dark, veined. The air inside the main complex felt still, expectant. Outside, everything was alive. Everything was growing. He thought he heard a breath of sound, imagined maybe, but known. Then another, gentle, intentional, followed by a pause. He smiled. 2 sets of barefoot footsteps approached from behind. The first was light, almost cautious. The second was heavier, more grounded, but not hesitant. One lighter, the other heavier, but both familiar. He didn't turn. A long, pale hand appeared in his peripheral vision. Between its fingers, held carefully by the outer shell, was a Japanese rhinoceros beetle. Massive and gleaming, its solid brown shell looked polished like old wood. The hand placed it on his arm. Kageyama watched it begin to crawl up, unhurried, toward his hand. "Perfect," he whispered, in Japanese. The other hand followed, setting down a lacquered wooden tray in front of him on the low table. Soy sauce had been painted on the gyoza with a brush, just as he preferred. The plate was warm. Rachel and Silas both sat beside him at the table. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Kageyama adjusted the folds of his robe and nodded once, almost imperceptibly, in acknowledgement. They all sat together like that, watching their beetles, watching each other smiling without needing to explain why. After a while, the 3 of them rose and walked toward the edge of the main complex where the stone stairway began. The stairway was 3 blocks wide, 18 feet across, rising in a slow architectural rhythm. No separate steps had been set. Instead, the stairway had been carved into the face of the stacked blocks. At the summit was a flat platform, smooth and unmarred, 6 feet wide and 18 across, meant for pausing. The stairway had been placed between two massive Siberian larches. These trees had been planted many decades ago, from seed, into square jade block planters, each planter itself constructed from 3 stacked blocks on each side and 6 blocks tall, forming a 36-foot tall square structure with an open center filled with soil. Kageyama had spent a fortune on the soil for the planters. It had to be right. Most of Silas and Rachel's remains were buried in them. Each of them was placed in the planter closest to the home they had lived in, Rachel to the right, Silas to the left. Their remains had been placed only a foot beneath the seed when it was first planted, close enough for the roots to find them. The trees had grown in unchallenged space. The base of the trunk stood as high as the tops of most trees. The trees grew so rapidly it had even surprised Kageyama. Those who ascended to the top of the staircase stood at mid-height of the giant Siberian larches in planters, surrounded by towering birch, spruce, and other larches. It was not just a staircase. It was a way to enter the forest and become part of it. Rachel and Silas stood at the top, hand in hand, something they had never once grown tired of over all these decades. Kageyama stood to their right, and he said, "Truth is stranger than fiction." These words carried powerful weight. Silas turned toward Rachel, who had given him his deepest desire, that someone might love him more than he loved them. He had never thought it possible. She saw it in his eyes, just as clearly as he had once seen it in hers. She remembered, without needing to speak, the footage from long ago, Dimitri's surveillance video once shown at trial. The world had watched them die together, but there had been no bodies, and therefore, at first, no crime. It had been Kageyama who provided the proof, who uncovered the burial, who forced the truth to the surface. They looked at this great man now, remembering what he'd once said, decades earlier. People can handle clones, but you can never tell them what you are. Not that there's a word for it anyway. Kageyama had been wearing the Casper crown since that morning. On the inside of the band was an engraving. People absorb their surroundings. Dogs are sinless, drawing our purest side. The 3 rows of gems, Prenite for green, Labradorite for gray, and Hessonite for orange, represented the sun, sky, and grass. The crown represented the purity and loyalty of dogs, and honored Japan with a large circle, a homage to the Japanese flag, where Silas's most cherished childhood memory had taken place, and the bust of Casper, Silas's dog, standing with its ears flopping about and mouth open, the face coming off and out of the crown like it's alive. Overall, it represented loyalty, honor, and joy. That Kageyama chose to wear it on this day, with them, was a gesture neither Rachel nor Silas would ever forget. At the edge of the platform, Kageyama lifted one hand. The beetle on his wrist paused, then opened its shell and flew. Rachel and Silas's beetles followed, as if responding to the same signal coming from the depths of the dense Siberian forest. They watched in reverent silence as the beetles vanished into the trees. As the beetles flew away, suddenly a deep, powerful laugh erupted from Kageyama. It echoed rich and full through the open corridor of trees and stone. He laughed for nearly a full minute, a rare laugh, a generous laugh. Rachel and Silas remained where they were, knowing better than to follow. That sound had not been meant for them to join in. It had been a gift, A moment, a sound only the three of them would ever share. And then he turned and walked back alone. The path of jade beneath Kageyama stretched quiet and familiar as he made his way toward the mansion. They had all lived in it for decades and had designed together. His wife had died long ago, yet he was still married. That fact had never changed. Back inside the center of the mansion, in his private chambers where no one else ever entered, Kageyama stepped silently into the room he had not altered in decades. He sat on a cushion on the stone floor, cross-legged, and let the silence return. He sat before the window, an entire wall of glass, seamless and impossibly thick. It bore no dust, no flaw, not the kind of glass one could buy. It would never scratch, never break, never cloud. It belonged to a future that had arrived without announcement, woven silently into the present. Through it, he saw everything. The vast forest spreading outward in soft green waves, the wide staircase of carved jade, and the twin block planters at the front. Those two Siberian larches now towering into the sky. They were still there. Rachel and Silas stood where he had left them at the summit, together. It was just far enough that he could only make out their shapes, still upright, unmistakably them, close enough to be certain, but too distant for anything more. His gaze rose slightly. Just above them, just beyond the trees, was the farthest visible line, where the forest met the pale blue air like an ocean meeting sky. And for a moment, he thought of the past 60 years. He took quiet pride in what they had earned. No one had given it to them. Kageyama remembered a conversation from long ago. Silas had been beside him, Rachel too. They had been sitting much like today, and Silas had been telling a story from his childhood in Japan. He used to collect beetle shells, rhinoceros beetles specifically. He and his friends would leave out a plate with syrup on the doorstep, just enough to draw them in and wait. What had always amazed him, Silas had said, was how the beetles arrived through narrow corridors of concrete and stone, right in the middle of the city. Sometimes trees would appear between buildings or bamboo thickets tucked in tight corners, and that must have been where they came from. Nature still had ways of reaching the surface, even there, even in Tokyo. Kageyama had remembered catching them too, a different city, a different era, but the same. And now, on his 150th birthday, those memories had resurfaced, not because they had given him beetles, but because they had drawn the memories closer. That was the gift. He exhaled once, softly, as his mind moved through the long corridor of years. Rachel and Silas had died just before their 50th birthdays. There had been no chamber then, no way back. That part came later. The years between stretched long and silent, carved in grief. He was nearly 70 when he found the grave, and almost 90 when they returned. The forest had aged with him. They had lived in the Jade Mansion for 60 years now. In truth, they were both nearing 110, not in appearance but in fact. Their hair, like his, had turned entirely white, though none of them had lost a single strand. Rachel's volcanic black eyes had never dimmed, not in spirit and not in love. They still held the same silent knowing. They remained impossibly wide, a sharp contrast to her white hair, like the snowstone pendant around her neck, the one she always wore. Kageyama had given them both their pendants back, the very ones Dmitri had taken from their bodies. Silas always wore his too. Rachel's face, her hair parted, a few strands blown back, her large ears calmly present, listening as they always had. His eyes drifted in thought. They weren't on the platform anymore. Gone now, likely walking among the horses, needing to be part of the forest again. He returned to his thoughts. Kageyama had been the only one, the only human who had seen into their minds, if only for a split second. They had always come, from time to time in the blink of an eye, always while the three of them slept. All of them remembered pieces, fragments of light, of stillness, of being scanned and gently sifted through, like pages in a book, by knobbly jointed, unclothed, mottled-skinned greys with large almond-shaped eyes. Their skin had a strong bluish tint, and its exact texture and patterning was unlike anything on earth. They had all agreed to call them the Blues. What he had seen couldn't be put into words. It couldn't be. He was human. The only way to come close was that their actions followed a logic not unlike a human rewatching a film they loved, or playing a song on repeat. Something familiar, something they wanted to witness again. But they were more than that, not just a story or melody. More like an ancient manuscript, rare, misunderstood, a living record of a world long gone, priceless, like large cut rubies. Each scan was quiet, methodical, like an archivist turning pages by gloved hand. They came not to feel, they came to witness, and they always returned, although rarely remembered. People are people, he said aloud, though no one was near. The Blues varied, no different than people. Some liked to observe, to study, to read. Some encounters felt like being caught mid-fall, like a parent reaching to catch a child. Others were darker, like a mind that kills over and over, for reasons that only make sense to itself. Kageyama only knew three things, truths he had taken from that one split second when he had somehow held on while they were scanning him one night. The glimpse into their mind had been brief, but absolute. A connection no human was meant to survive. The first, he was grateful they were the archivist type. The second, they were not gods, but they were the most powerful creatures in the universe. And the third, they were among the oldest of their kind. Not immortal, but older than his mind could hold. They had all spoken of the same visitors, the tall Blues, never the smaller ones described in other accounts. Kageyama had come close to understanding something during that moment. It had to do with age, with form. For years he had quietly believed that the taller they were, the older they were. But eventually he settled on the simpler idea. Perhaps they were two separate species. They had never seen any but the tall ones. And although he would never know it, he had been right from the beginning. They were the same species. The taller the older the bluer. Their skin was pale dove gray, mottled like jade, with a translucent wash of robin's egg blue drifting over it, like a color layer not fully merged. And the others, the smaller ones spoken of in other accounts, had existed too. They were real, and they were solid gray. The beetles were gone. But Rachel and Silas had not come down. They stood at the top of the jade staircase, hand in hand, watching the morning take shape. The light was rising slow, not in rays, but in presence, creeping through branches, draping across the trunks, catching only where it was allowed. No words had passed between them since Kageyama's laugh. The forest breathed around them, distant hoarse sounds folding softly into bird song, the occasional hollow thud of hooves against earth, the high-throated calls of unseen birds threading through the canopy like reeds in wind. Even the insects had changed pitch. Everything here moved in one direction, upward. Rachel tilted her head slightly, not to look at him, but to listen better. Her ears caught the air, those same wide, unmistakable shapes that framed her face with unshakable honesty. Silas glanced at her profile, the shape of it, the long, beautiful nose, the severity that never turned cruel, elegant in a way that bordered on eerie. She had not smiled yet. She didn't need to. It was not that kind of moment. Below, the forest shimmered. Silas didn't look down, neither did Rachel. They both knew what lay at the base of these trees, the bones of their bodies. Both their pendants, Rachel's with the snowstone and Silas's, simply her face, had never left their necks since their return. Removed only for sleep, they had become part of them, as if their absence would mean something was missing, never to be lost again, never hidden. They turned together and began walking down, slowly without urgency, following the familiar path to the edge of the forest where they would slip into the trees and walk as they always had. Through the forest that never stopped growing, into the silence they had come to trust. The scent was the first thing to settle, as if the forest wrapped it around them slowly, like moving into dense fog. It soaked in with their every step, thick with the smell of dirt and the quiet sweetness of larch and spruce. Birch bark peeled in long ribbons like a snake shedding skin. Even where the ground looked dry, the air still smelled of water, old water left behind in the wood. Roots jutted like ribs from the ground, exposed and smooth by decades of hoof and rain. Rachel walked barefoot. Silas didn't, but the difference meant nothing. They both wore the same outfit every day, the same thing they always had. Black shirts with the sleeves cut off, seams frayed from time. Black jean shorts. The uniform of two people who had stopped trying to explain their pasts. They had both once had black hair. Bright colors made them uncomfortable, even now. Their room back in the Jade Mansion was the opposite of Kageyama's. His had an entire wall made of glass open to the world. Theirs had no windows at all. The walls were solid stone, with an entrance shaped like a thin vertical rectangle just wide enough for Rachel to walk through comfortably. The bronze door was plain, with no window, and the floor sat a few inches lower than the hall outside. So when the door closed, no light entered. They used candles for light. Their pasts had shaped them both into solitary nocturnal creatures, the only pair of their breed. Their footsteps weren't alone anymore. A few Yakuchin horses passed nearby, never in line with them, always on their own course, like wanderers crossing paths in a dream. Their breath was slow, their movement even slower. The two humans didn't follow, didn't reach. They only watched and kept walking. They had walked for a long time. How long didn't matter. The forest had held them quietly. But no silence could ever truly erase what they were made from. Even happiness didn't fix the shape of a mind. Rachel knew it without thinking. She could always feel it when the world around him began to become darker and darker. It never looked like much, a glance that lingered too long, a stillness in his eyes that held just a little too firmly. He wasn't gone, just adrift again, hovering near that edge where the ghost world began. She squeezed his hand, not tightly. Just enough to say, "I see you." He turned. His face softened, but some part of him stayed in the fog. So she kissed him. Still here, still hers. But the ghost world would never leave him, and he had just crossed over. Their eyes remained open, both of them. Hers didn't blink, didn't shift, just held him, wide and black, as if they could trap time. There was no pleading in them, only a quiet force, unstoppable, like winter. The ghost world recoiled. It wasn't a question. It was the answer he'd been trying to remember. That her love was what always brought him back, and the only reason he could still feel what happiness was. They didn't speak. They never needed to. Not about this. It had happened too many times before. Her eyes always found him. His always came back. They'd been out long enough. That's all it ever was. A shared feeling. No cue, no sign. Just the same quiet timing rising in both of them. They entered their room. It was a 30-foot rectangle, built from smooth stone with a 10-foot ceiling overhead. The bed was wide, large enough to sleep four, with no frame, just a thick mattress laid flat into a recess in the floor. Beside it stood a solid table made of jade, the size of a dinner table, used for anything they needed. Stone shelves were carved directly into the walls, deep, clean spaces for their clothes. The rest was open. They had never added anything else. There was nothing more they needed. Rachel lit the candles on the table beside the bed. Then she walked over and closed the door behind them. The room went pitch black, except for the steady flame. They sat with their backs against the stone wall, shoulders just touching. Neither said anything. They had already said everything people could say, a long time ago. They had become the kind of people who felt more than they spoke, not because they were broken, but because words just didn't carry enough weight. They both had dark minds. Their love was feral. Rachel looked into Silas's eyes. 70 years of love between them, carved from time they weren't supposed to have. And still it had never felt like enough. Her eyelids lowered like curtains, slow, certain, into bedroom eyes. Her mouth parted in a smile that belonged only to him. Wide, knowing, deep. Then she stood. Candlelight pulled itself across her skin like water. She turned her back to him, the movement smooth, deliberate. She was only a few feet from the bed, just close enough that the edge rose near her knees. Silas's eyes lingered. Her hips gave way to two soft, distinct shapes, long and gently parted, as if molded by wind into a resting pair of wings. From the small of her back, a single line extended, longer than most, wings only height could shape, stretched by long bone and form. Her wings were full of dimples, gravity she had always carried there, and nowhere else. She lingered near the stone table, her left hand drifting across its edge, as if searching for something. Silas's gaze didn't leave her. He exhaled, sharp and quiet. Rachel let out a giggle, so soft, haunting, and so rarely heard it felt like a spell whispered just for him. Then she turned. But before her lips found his, she leaned slightly forward. Her chest formed two small cones, spreading outward in a soft, rounded bloom, wide, soft, and seen only by him, nearly half of each petal pink. Then she kissed him, slow, deliberate, his face lit with something unguarded, like joy pressed into hunger. She lifted the candle from the table. Only one had been lit. Then, walking backward, she moved into the darkness. Just before vanishing, she blew the flame out. Silas listened. A moment later the sound came, the candle being placed at the far end of the table, just loud enough for him to hear. A sound meant for him, a cue. They had rituals, he had his, she had hers. And the oldest games were always the best. This one, neither of them had ever tired of. Hide and seek. Kageyama lay still beneath the lights on the evening of his 150th birthday. One machine filtered his blood through a centrifugal loop, separating the golden plasma from the darker red cells. The yellow liquid collected in a clear bag to his right, already halfway full. On the left, another bag slowly returned fresh plasma, fortified, rebalanced, held to exact parameters. He had connected the lines himself. He had taught himself everything. No assistance, no ceremony, only discipline, only privacy. His hand moved slightly. Between two fingers he held the capsule, larger than most. Tan, smooth, one of the most advanced substances ever created, developed in silence, held in the hands of almost no one. A life-extending pill. It didn't stop aging, but it slowed it, nearly 75%. The body still aged, but didn't show it. Skin, hair, joints, preserved for now. This was his second. He never told them each one cost more than this entire jade mansion. He placed the capsule on his tongue and swallowed dry. The machine continued. Time, borrowed again. Kageyama remembered all those years ago, the chamber, destroyed not a month after its success. He remembered the years spent building it. He thought of Nikolai, the disturbed genius who had created it. He thought of those years and he closed his eyes, grateful, even still today, that they had passed. After a long day, Nikolai Voronin fell asleep at his desk. That night, while the archivist, the blues, were flipping through his mind, they lingered. Nikolai Voronin was a genius. That alone had drawn their attention. They were telepathic, though that word hardly captured the breadth of their perception. They had passed through many human minds containing fragments of Silas and Rachel, their faces, their jewelry, the trial footage, but none of those minds carried the same frequency as Voronin's. His mind had been dense with obsession, jewelry, grave, video, everything loaded with weight and meaning, the kind of signal that, in their terms, created tension in the field. They had lingered for the briefest moment, not because they understood. They didn't. The weight and tension focused on the video, them dropping, their deaths, the stillness, but something in that moment reflected, faintly, what they do when things stop moving. They didn't even realize they had left something behind, but they had. The concept embedded itself in him like a download. The atom, used as a resonant key to re-access its own informational echo embedded in the field, not too different from reversing time. Only a single atom from the original biological specimen was required. When they finally turned on the chamber, everything changed. You could step into it, on it, or run your hand through it. It was inert to them, non-reactive, unresisting, but it was there. It didn't react to bodies, only to their resonance. Only Rachel and Silas. The bases, two identical cubes, each 10 feet wide and a foot tall, had been built by Nikolai alone. Dense, silent technology, sealed, perfect, unknowable, packed with mechanisms so tightly hidden they felt more biological than manufactured. The space-time directly above began to vibrate. 10 square feet, previously inert, now shimmered with movement. You could walk through it, but your eyes resisted what they saw. The air shimmered, vibrated. A spectral haze took shape, cube-shaped, barely visible, like heat rising off concrete, only slower, heavier. Inside the shimmer, atoms moved in ways no organic system could replicate, but still, the field was biologically inert to anyone else. Each atom emitted a near invisible trace of color, and somehow that color felt real, solid, like something that could be touched or swallowed. Light was caught in it. Sound didn't echo near it. Vibrations from the floor stopped at its edges. Something fundamental was shifted. Nikolai had called it a resonance displacement cube, a localized anomaly in the space-time field, subtly self-tuned to only one biological pattern. Time didn't so much rewind as resonate backward, slowly coaxing structure into place. Regrowth was not imposed, but remembered. Kageyama never explained the chamber in detail. He only said that everything is connected, that everything vibrates and everything is made of light, that their consciousness, their memories, was still out there, not unlike telepathy, like oil in water, dispersed but present, and that this chamber could freeze the water, could draw it together again. Small amounts of bone from each of their remains were placed in the center of each cube, the cubes placed side by side. Kageyama and Nikolai had watched in awe. To avoid stealing even a single memory, they had been brought back slowly. A year in reverse compressed into 10 minutes. Every 10 minutes that passed, the remains grew, flesh and bone took shape, decomposition ran backward. Shapeless masses turned human again, first the outline, then the definition, then skin. Kageyama remembered the years it had taken to build the chamber, those unbearable years. Every day, listening to Nikolai rant for hours, wild, brilliant theories, incomprehensible equations. Kageyama had understood none of it. But from the very beginning, the day Nikolai tracked him down, Kageyama had heard it in his voice, seen it in his eyes. That kind of certainty only shows up once in a person's life. It had to be honored. Silas and Rachel had their lives stolen, decades still ahead of them. Nothing was more despicable to Kageyama than what Dmitri had done. It became his duty to see this through. But Nikolai had been the most unbearable man Kageyama had ever met. And still, on that day, they got their lives back. As the bodies stood straighter, nearly upright, Kageyama ordered Nikolai to slow the reversal. 1 second of their lives reversed should equal 1 full minute of Kageyama's time. It had to be perfect, no mistakes. The process slowed. He watched them rise, ever so slightly taller, then upright. He grunted, loud and sharp, unable to suppress the sound, as he watched the final moment rewind. He had seen the video, Dimitri's video, stupidly kept on his own device, the same video used in the trial. That part had looked like smoke rising from the tops of their heads. Warm blood turned to mist in the shock of warmth meeting winter, carried upward in a soft trailing plume. It was heartbreaking to watch. Nearly everyone had. Kageyama had clothes ready. Rachel's sword, the dragon book, their 2 pendants, all laid out on a steel rolling table. 2 pills, 2 syringes, lorazepam, adrenaline. He watched the bullet holes shrink, skin tighten, then he saw it, one of their chests rising, breathing, slow motion. He almost passed out. They were whole. Nikolai was watching, staring, looking her up and down. Kageyama had seen the way he looked at the sculptures of Rachel, the way he spoke of her like a goddess. He understood what was coming. Nikolai would never relent. He would obsess. He would try to take her, almost certainly try to kill Silas at some point. When Nikolai, trying to appear clinical, ran his hand just past the small of her back, when he whispered, "You're fucking gorgeous," thinking Kageyama hadn't heard. That was enough. Kageyama had prepared. He had sharpened Rachel's shashka the night before, cleaned it, honed it. He knew which button would stop the reversal. He knew when. Nikolai had thought of the items on the table like artifacts in a museum. He never questioned why Rachel's sword was unsheathed, why it lay perfectly aligned. He had praised it to Nikolai that same morning. Its sharpness, its design, built to cut through animals. Silent as a machine, Kageyama stepped forward. 2 flawless cuts. The first removed the hand, the second the head. The last thing Nikolai heard was the word Dahme, loud enough to echo like thunder. Not a human voice, not really. A sound like nature had spoken through Kageyama, a black hole of command. Nikolai felt goosebumps rip through him. One eye still worked, the other had drifted. He watched his own severed hand hit the floor, fingers curled inward. A breath later, his face struck the stone, hard. His head rolled just enough to the side for the last thing Nikolai to see before he was gone was Kageyama's sneer. Kageyama picked up the 3 parts, hand, head, body, placed them on a thick black plastic tarp that had been patiently waiting in a nearby drawer, and dragged them into another room. He quickly mopped the floor. He noticed a drop of blood on Rachel's back. He left it. He would never touch her without permission. Ever. They were just at the start of the lean forward to the world's most famous kiss. That was the moment. Cleaning had lost them a few seconds of their memories. Kageyama could live with that. Kageyama stopped the reversal. They both inhaled a single breath. They couldn't speak, couldn't look away. They had stumbled naked to an embrace, clutching each other, crunched, twisted in on themselves as if trying to hide inside one another. Their bodies trembled violently, heads thrown back, necks arched so far they looked broken, their faces aimed toward the ceiling, but their eyes rolled downward, wide, wild, trying to understand. Their eyes blazing like torches. Kageyama never forgot how they had looked, although he learned to bear it with time. He injected them both with lorazepam. It took days before the seizures stopped, though not truly seizures, just terror. Pure, uncontrollable terror. Their minds fighting ferociously to not shatter. When their minds found peace in each other again, he showed them the video from Dimitri's trial, everything online, how they were loved. Kageyama also brought them back to their homes and to the chamber one last time before destroying it, for them to process. He explained it all, leaving nothing unspoken. All the conversations between the 3 of them over many decades, the only one Rachel and Silas never shared, is that they could both remember standing in the snow, just starting to lean in for a kiss, and about a few minutes before Kageyama killed Nikolai. Silas's eyes saw everything. Rachel had mostly only heard, as her back had been turned. She had felt Nikolai's hand, heard the sounds, but never saw it. This had all happened behind Rachel, in Silas's direct field of view. Kageyama was wise enough to suspect this, but he never did. They knew he had thrown this memory deep and never once picked it up throughout all the years. They were certain, and were correct in believing, that he thought their new memories, the brought back ones, had started again when he stopped the resonance displacement cubes. Kageyama's sword and success had blinded him from seeing it in their eyes and seeing the quickness of their love for him. The 3 of them were tigers in spirit. Every meal was one-on-one, a fight to the death. Kageyama had become the father the both of them never really had. The smell of ramen, soon to be eaten often by both of them in the yet unbuilt jade mansion, had always seemed to draw out the memory for Rachel, not what she saw, but heard. Da me. It was the boiled egg cut in half. She knew it. Siberia had hidden their jade home again. The forest had closed around it, heavy with snow. The canopy above was no longer branches. It was a ceiling, thick and seamless, a slab of white pressing downward from the sky. It looked like clouds had collapsed and frozen in place. Only at the forest's edge, where light struck, did that white break into shadow, and the shadows moved. Long, deliberate shapes, like 100 tigers prowling just beyond sight. Their eyes seemed to watch from the limbs above, their bodies stretched into the branches. Snow slipped from the upper branches in soundless sheets. What didn't fall simply watched. A wide jade platform extended 30 feet out from every side of the home, forming a clean, continuous border to hold back wild growth, so they could step outside for air, for sun, for small things, without walking into the forest unless it called for them. The brooms were coarse and bristled for snow, long-handled and heavy, their wooden grips worn smooth from years of winter. Today the snow was powdery, so the shovels stayed inside. They always swept before it could grow heavy enough to need more. The brooms had been set by the door weeks ago, waiting. The snow came often, and it pleased them to keep the colors visible, the deep greens, browns, yellows, and white veins of the jade beneath. Silas and Kageyama worked the wide platform in front of the home. Rachel cleared the path that led to the jade stairway, and the stairway itself, her height drawing her toward the taller things. Kageyama was dressed in heavy robes that wrapped around him from neck to wrists to ankles, with a thick wool-lined layer between other layers. His steps were steady in simple winter shoes, made for the cold and the quiet. Rachel and Silas wore sapogi boots, tall, black with the faint ripples of use at the ankles, thick wool pants, thick winter coats, wool hats, thin leather gloves, everything black. Kageyama was the richest man on earth. He had been wealthy before, but the book had made him something else. It sold across the planet, a precise record of what had happened, part memoir and part account of how he had come to value Silas's work. It drew from the evidence he gathered to secure their exhumation, proving beyond doubt who they were and that they were gone. The pages held technical forensic photographs, their graves, the homes they had lived in, everything. Few ever came to this region. It was too remote, too unwelcoming, and the book became the only way most would ever see it. When he acquired the molds Silas had kept, not all, but many, he poured wax into those originals to make perfect wax copies, then used those to create entirely new molds before time could wear the originals down. From those molds came replicas that could be ordered in any alloy Silas had ever used, catalogued and known, and with any heat treatment to bring the colors a client wanted. Each came for a price that matched the man who made them. The book and the replicas bought this place. Silas loved it. Every new casting was another piece left behind, another question of how long they would last. It was during the sweeping that he told them, "Someone wishes the Silas I made to create a piece," Kageyama said. "More than anyone has offered before. Enough to do good with." The buyer didn't know if the clone could even make jewelry. Kageyama had told him yes, that he had studied the original's work, loved it, and still worked at it. They finished sweeping and went inside. The display rooms were museums of stone, room after room, each lined with tall jade cases under perfect light. The walls were jade, and the thin, plain cases were jade as well. Inside, each case held dozens of pieces of jewelry, every one a different shape, catching and holding the light in its own way. Glass covered them, only to keep out dust. Together they gave the impression of beautiful moving insects. The benches were carved from solid jade. "Can you help me choose?" Silas said to Rachel, his eyes full of love. Rachel moved through the rows without hurry. Silas followed, seeing it as nothing more than the smallest chance to give her something to enjoy. She had never tired of his work, and she had helped bury every piece he wanted to bury, somewhere on the 15 miles they called theirs, often choosing the location. She stopped before one. This one. Inside was an allegory of reflection into one's self. Two profiles of the same face looked toward each other, both slightly turned away, as if about to face the viewer instead. The outline of the pendant was a doorway. The faces at the top were sleek, not raised far from the surface, which was otherwise flat and rounded. At the base, the pendant ended flat, giving the impression that both figures were stepping through the doorway, carrying their reflections with them. "Clones," Silas said quietly. Kageyama answered, grunted in agreement. Rachel took it out of its display case, the faintest crack of a smile at the corner of her mouth as she picked up the pendant, second breath, and handed it to Kageyama. They all knew that in a few weeks it would be all over the news, that the clone's signature was identical, engraved with the same dental needle, and that the texture and methods of working the wax could be matched in scans of the surface. They knew they had something to look forward to, laughs they would share when it all came out. They walked calmly through the displays, and when they reached the hallway where everything split, Kageyama went his way, and they went theirs. Down the hall, Rachel said softly, "I'm hungry." They walked to the kitchen. Rachel asked Silas to make her some toast and butter it. He knew she was still full, and she knew he always needed a snack about now. "Just toast," Silas said, his eyes lowering almost imperceptibly as he turned to her. "Yeah," she said, showing her full set of long, even teeth in a smile that made Silas's heart pound hard in his chest. As soon as his back was turned and his hands were on the bread, he heard the door open and close, the one that led to the pathway, to the stairs, and off to the sides, the forest. He smiled, made himself a piece of toast and ate it, laughing out loud a few times with joy as he chewed, his chest rising and falling rapidly from laughter. He slung his hat on his head and stepped through the door. As he made his way to the forest's edge, he started shaping a new design in his head, one he would only half finish that day. Rachel's face turned to the side, partially hidden, cocooned by two large, long wings folding over her entire body, wrapping around her. He walked off the path, following a single pair of long footsteps in the snow. "Couldn't miss him if I tried," Silas said, smiling to himself. He followed them to the edge of the forest, where they grew fainter and fainter in the darkness under the dense, snow-covered canopy. "Ready or not, here I come," he said quietly, chuckling. He was certain she would best him. Born into this forest, she would make him lose the trail. He wouldn't hear her coming, and he wouldn't resist when she tackled him. Their love was feral. The cart's weight spoke in low wooden groans with every shift of the wheels. Sunlight fell in clean sheets across the dirt road, catching on the copper rim of the kerosene lantern that hung unused from their bent iron arms. The day was too bright for them, no need to set the wicks burning. Shadows were thin and brief, no place for flame. Slava sat high in the worn seat, the reins resting in her hands. Her Yakutian horse moved in the slow, patient rhythm of an animal that understood work. The cart behind them was heavy with hay, oats, and whole grain. The smell of them, dry, faintly sweet, moved in and out of the wind. Her children ran alongside, Dravka 12 first, her dark hair pinned back with nothing more than will, her stride clean and sure. Yar 11 followed, quieter in his motion, the way he was in all things. They drifted toward the jade wall that lined the road, where the 6-foot-tall forest-colored faces, browns, greens, whites, and yellows, rose in a long, unbroken line. The blocks were flush at their fronts, but between them lay narrow gaps, never enough for even a small horse to pass through. They were running alongside the cart, playing their usual game, springing up to run along the sides of the cube-shaped blocks, their shoes thudding against the flat stone before gravity pulled them back down. They managed 3 or 4 steps each time, then landed in the dirt and sped up to try again. Their laughter stayed silent in their throats, released only as quickened breath. Slava watched them without calling them back. She liked the sight, the sure-footedness, the way their bodies tested the wall and trusted it. Let them keep it. Ahead the gate stood, its simple, thick, bronze bars set with a latch that could be reached from either side. You turned a knob on the thick, long bronze rod, pulling it back a few inches to slide it out of its hole, to open the door. They reached it, and Slava set the brake with her boot. Dravka was the first to reach the bronze. She slid the latch, and Yar pushed the gate with both palms. It gave slowly, the old hinges deepening their tone as they turned. They entered. The tunnel stretched ahead, running directly from the outer road to Kageyama's mansion. It had been built after the mansion itself, designed as a winter lifeline for the horses, a place to keep them fed and sheltered when the storms came, when blizzards made it impossible for a person to walk the open ground. The Yakutians could manage, but people could not. Slava's winter cart had narrow steel bands around its wooden wheels, each fitted with smooth, rounded studs about half an inch high, enough to grip packed snow and ice without tearing the concrete road beneath the tunnel. The tunnel swallowed the light. The window set every 20 feet bled in enough sun to keep it from going black. What light did enter felt thin, strained, as if reluctant to cross the threshold. The roof rose in a clean triangle, with thick Siberian larch planks laid over logs that interlocked every 10 feet. The roof and sides were first built from logs, then sheathed in planks, with both the exterior faces of the logs and the interior faces of the planks coated in a pine tar and charcoal paste. On the roof, the planks sat flush beneath copper sheets, each sheet running from one log joint to the next in the 10-foot sections. The copper sheets overlapped with a bent lip on alternating sides, so rainwater could never find a seam. At the peak, 3 capstones per 10-foot section anchored into the holes in the copper sheets, their prongs locking each side into place. The copper was 1/4 inch thick, made to endure for thousands of years. Its pale green, weathered skin merged with the surrounding trees, as if the forest had claimed it long ago. The sound of her wooden cart passing through carried down the length of the passage, each turn of its wheels echoing in hollow, uneven rolls that lingered longer than they should have. Inside, the air carried a scent both familiar and faintly oppressive, part wood, part earth, part something older, tar-baked in seasons past, refusing to fade. Nails in every plank were stainless steel, driven to outlast the hands that had placed them. Every half-mile, alternating on either side of the tunnel, a roofed shelter opened, feeding centers, their shadows deep, wide enough for a single horse to step in, long enough to hold 100 pressed flank to flank during blizzard nights. This was the tunnel's true purpose in winter, not to keep the herds alive, for they could endure without it, but to ensure they prospered, well fed and sheltered when the wind and ice would have stripped the land bare. Slava had filled them all countless times. Even in summer, the sound here was different. Hoofsteps landed deeper, the cartwheels muttering against the lime concrete beneath. This road would not wear out, not in her lifetime. 3 feet thick, poured to last until memory no longer knew who had walked it, and with that change in light, her mind began to open the older door. The darkness in the tunnel always reminded her of the long car ride, those hours without number, only the ache in her legs, the taste of air through rust holes in the trunk's metal skin. She had been 16, Dravka only a year old in her arms, her body already carrying the second. She had not dared to sleep. The hum of tires had been constant, the darkness entire. No lamps, no voice, only the sense of moving away from something that would never forgive her for leaving. When the car stopped, it was at the outer gate to Kageyama's land. She simply slid the rod and opened the gate. The tunnel swallowed her. The air inside was colder, its dampness clinging to her cheeks and settling in her hair. She walked it in the middle of the night, left hand brushing the log wall to find her way, Dravka held tight against her side. Her steps echoed, slow and uneven, as if the darkness itself wanted her to misstep. The logs felt slick in places, dry in others, and the faint smell of earth rose with every movement of her fingers. When she reached the end, she didn't knock. She sat against the wall beside the bronze door, drawing her knees up and wrapping her arms tight around Dravka. The floor leached heat from her legs, the wall pressing its weight into her back like a second shadow. She dozed without meaning to. A sharp chorus of birds woke her, far away but carrying down the tunnel. She waited longer, long enough for the sound to shift, for the light to press against the bronze of the door. Only when she was sure someone inside might be awake did she finally knock. Kageyama was already known across the world by then, not for his wealth, though he was already becoming the richest man alive, but for what he had done with it. The money from his book and from the replicas of Silas's work had been invested 100-fold into what the world had thought impossible. He had grown vast fields of quinoa across the planet, some the size of small countries, and given every grain away for free. Every place on earth that sold food, from the largest supermarket to the smallest village shop, had thick, printless brown paper bags of it, 1 pound and 10-pound sizes, sitting on their shelves. The bags never sat long. People ate it as soon as they took it. He had planted trees wherever people wanted them, not to cure the climate, but to help it. Forests raised in patterns across the globe like a second shelter belt, only this one wrapped the earth. And he had done the same with water. In the same year, every person alive had been given a device that fit in one hand, needed no batteries, lasted for generations, and gave an ounce of water every hour. Once the compartments were full, they stopped until space was free again. It drew the water from the air, though no one could say exactly how. Although the science community knew, they kept silent, and the world cared more for the result than the method. Dozens of countries had helped fund the effort, but it had been Kageyama who made it real. All of it, every seed, every tree, every device, had come from the fortune he had turned outward the moment it was in his hands. Kageyama opened the door, patiently listening as she explained everything honestly, never once speaking or interrupting. She asked for a job feeding horses, having heard of the Yakutian horse sanctuary. He smiled, bowed slightly, and raised an arm, beckoning her inside. He made food for the baby and for her, though she would never know what it was. While they ate, he sat at the table, texting on his phone without a word. The next day, a large amount of baby food was delivered. Within a week, her home was built. During that time, Kageyama continued to feed her meals but never spoke aloud. When it was ready, a man arrived riding a Yakutian horse, pulling a wooden cart that would become hers, and brought her to her nearby home. Kageyama bowed as she left, but kept watching from the open doorway until she was gone from sight. Even then, she felt his gaze in the distance, an old man whose exact age she could not guess, but who was clearly well past 100. The cartwheels carried her forward through the tunnel. The wood kept speaking in its low voice. The children had gone quiet now, walking close to the wheels, listening. Somewhere ahead, the light would return in full. But for now, in this dimness, the sound of the horse's breath filled the space like tide water, steady, patient, unafraid. And Slava let it lead them on. They moved through the tunnel, stopping at each great feeding chamber that opened to the left and right every half mile. Each was closed off by a bronze door. Built like a smaller version of the front gate they had passed earlier, its weight solid and cold, fitted with a simple sliding latch rod that could be drawn from either side. Inside, wooden troughs lined the walls, ready for hay, oats, and whole grains. The air in each space seemed to hang heavier than the corridor, shadows pooling in the corners where the light could not reach. Hoof scuffs marked the floor in uneven arcs, and the faint dry rustle of hay shifted underfoot. They worked in silence, the echo of feet hitting wood carrying into the dimness. For nearly an hour the pattern repeated, left, right, left again, until the last trough was filled. When they finally stepped back into the light, Dravka and Yar darted to the jade block wall, resuming their game. Later that night, Slava smiled when she heard Dravka's whisper, "Be quiet, you'll wake Mama," and the soft stutter of steps learning how to tiptoe. Dravka's kerosene lantern gave itself away, a small creak from its thick wire handle, a faint click where the metal cage held the glass. Its light wavered once across Slava's doorway, then slid away along the hall like a candle carried inside a cupped hand. She lay still, listening to the latch, the hush of night air, their careful steps fading into the dark. When the last sound was gone, she closed her eyes again. They were tough. They would be fine. "Wait for me," Yar called, running after Dravka toward the tunnel, chasing the pale sway of her lantern light. He caught her quickly. They moved with the same speed. The tunnel ahead was pitch black, and Dravka's kerosene lantern, held out in front of her with an outstretched arm, lit her face from below, so that from Yar's view it looked as if she were floating through the dark like wind through tall grass. They took the first left into the feeding area, slipped through a narrow door, past the long roof in front of it, and ran to where the horses stood. The animals shifted their weight as the children approached. Every horse there knew these two, had learned the sound of their steps, the tone of their laughter. One flicked an ear forward, another turned its head to watch, eyes catching the faintest gleam from the lantern. The air around them smelled of dry hay. The children vaulted onto two of them in a single practiced motion. Dravka's laugh broke loud into the stillness as she urged her horse forward, holding the lantern out ahead so its glow caught the ground and the trees, with beams of moonlight breaking through here and there to help light the way. Her mount moved with an easy stretch of muscle. The steady thud of hooves answered moments later by Yar's. He leaned low and pushed his horse faster, closing the gap until the two rode neck and neck. Dravka grinned back over her shoulder, shouted something he couldn't catch, then kicked forward again, making him chase her. The forest took her light into its pitch-black canopy, the beams of moonlight breaking through in slender shafts, just enough to ride. They darted between them, each trying to be the first through the brighter patches, as though the light was a finish line. They rode hard, laughing without knowing how far that sound would carry. The horse's breath came in soft bursts, ears swiveling at the distant crack of branches and the unseen shapes in the trees. Back at the house, Slava laughed out loud. They rode all the way to the jade staircase, told the horses to wait. The animals stood patient, tails flicking lazily. They knew these were children who would always return to tend to them, and so they settled, shifting their weight in the moonlight as if standing watch. The two climbed to the platform. The vast canopy stretched below, moonlight gathering in broken pools where it touched the highest branches, their tops like dark green velvet. Between them, the darkness lay heavy, deep as old bruises, and there, at the top, they saw it. A flying saucer, far away yet sharp against the sky. If you stretched your arm and pinched it, it would be the size of a thumbnail. One large light in the center, 6 smaller lights in a ring around it. Behind it streamed a streak of orange and pink, with great bright sparks in the colors, as though the sky itself was burning. It hung there without sound, without movement, for nearly a minute. Then, in a single flash, it was gone. They stood there staring at the empty sky. The stillness felt heavier now that they'd stopped moving. Looked like an owl, Dravka whispered. Round. Big eyes. Yar waited a moment before speaking. Too far up for an owl, he murmured. Could have been one, maybe, Dravka said quickly, like she wanted to get the words out before she thought too hard about them. Yar shifted his weight, his voice low. That was wrong-looking, like something the forest pushed out because it was sick. Dravka's brow tightened. You ever see how animal eyes glow in lantern light at night? She asked, still watching the sky. Yeah, Yar said quietly. It glowed like that, she went on, like it was looking back. Yar's gaze stayed fixed on the place where it had been. Nothing has eyes in a circle, he whispered. Dravka spoke slower now, as if each word had to be found. Maybe an owl carrying its nest, full of owlets, on fire. That's more eyes. Yar shook his head faintly. Owls keep their young in the nest, he said under his breath. They don't fly with them. And fire like that, colors like that, nothing in the forest burns that way. Dravka stayed quiet for a moment longer, her eyes still on the empty sky. Then she turned toward the stairs. Still, could have been, she said, almost to herself. They didn't speak on the ride back to the first feeding place. The horses moved quickly, the same way they had come, sure of their path, unbothered by what the riders had seen. Dravka lifted the lantern just high enough to push its glow into the dark, a small circle of light moving with her. It wasn't the same kind of comfort it had been earlier. Now it made her think of how animal eyes flashed in its light, and how what they had seen glowed the same way, only with too many eyes. At the narrow gate for the horses, they dismounted. The animals stayed inside the sanctuary, calm in the dark as the riders stepped away. Dravka and Yar stepped through alone, sliding the rod latch on the bronze door. The tunnel closed around them, its walls pressing in, the echo of their steps quickening without meaning to. Out the other side, the dirt road home lay under a pale wash of lantern light. They kept low, slipping back through the dark until the shapes of their home rose ahead. Only then did they breathe, though neither said what they were thinking, that the lantern had shown them the way back, and that one night it would show something else the way in. That night the house had taken them back the way it always did, quietly, without asking. The door closed, the lantern was set down, and the walls kept what they'd seen. They slept without telling Slava, without telling anyone. Morning had no memory of it. The light came clear and unbroken, the air warm. It was the kind of day that didn't hold shadows unless you stepped under the trees. They cut across the field, where the grass grew higher than anywhere else around the village. Dravka's fingers trailed lightly over the seed heads, the thin stalks parting under her palm. Yar did the same, his hand level with hers. though he walked a pace behind. The path they took wasn't marked. It had formed only because they had walked it enough times that the grass leaned differently here. In places it closed over again, forcing them to push through with their arms. They didn't mind. They liked the way the stalks closed behind them, like no one would ever know they had passed. The forest waited on the other side, not the deep forest where no one went, but the outer edge, sparser, light slipping through in clean white columns. Beyond it sat the store, plain wood walls, a low roof, nothing painted. Inside, they knew, were the thick brown paper bags of quinoa, free to anyone who came. The grain had no weight to them anymore. They carried it home so often it felt like part of the air. Their feet made almost no sound. Only the grass moved, brushing their shins. They didn't talk about the saucer often. It wasn't because they were afraid. It was because it felt like theirs, something that belonged only to them as much as the tunnel or the horses. They had given it a name. The lantern owl. They had seen cars a few times, passing along the same dirt road they walked, though no one in the village owned one. Here, machines were almost a rumor, and nothing in their world had suggested that something made by hands could hang in the sky and stay there. Neither had heard the word alien. What they had seen that night was only another creature, one the forest had not shown to anyone else. They knew only the simple things: how to use the water devices they carried in their pocket, how to feed the horses, how to follow the old paths. Nothing about the world beyond the trees. Dravka slowed, brushing her palm over the grass. What if we see the lantern owl again? Her voice was flat with the thought. Maybe it'll have more eyes next time, she added, the way one might talk about berries ripening. Yar stepped closer, his hand dropping the grass. Good. The forest took them in without changing its sound. Birds still moved in the canopy. The breeze still turned the leaves. But both of them kept glancing between the branches, as if a circle of lights might be there, waiting, watching them the way animal eyes watch from the edge of a fire's glow. If it came again, they would know it, and if it had more eyes, they would count them. They didn't speak again until the store was in sight, its shadow stretching toward them across the packed dirt. The lantern owl was already something else entirely, more than what they'd seen. It was a story now, and it was theirs. They ate first. Quinoa in bowls with a little salt. The room was warm from the day. The lamp on the table was not lit yet. There was still enough daylight through the window. Yar finished before Dravka and rinsed his bowl. He swept the floor in slow lines, careful not to push dust under the cabinet legs. Dravka washed the dishes, holding each one in both hands to make sure it was clean. Slava watched them work and said nothing. They knew what to do. When the bowls were stacked and the plank floor looked clear again, Yar touched the small water device in his pocket and took a short drink. Dravka did the same. They did not waste it. They never did. Can we go ask him? Dravka said. Ask about what? Slava asked, though she knew. To tell him a story, Yar said. Tonight with a lantern. Slava looked at them for a long moment. Go, she said. Be quick. They ran. Out the door, down the road that led to the tunnel. Their steps were steady. They knew where their feet needed to land. The bronze latch on the outer gate slid back the way it always did when you pulled the rod right, and the door gave under Yar's palms. Inside, the tunnel air felt still. Not cold, just still. The light came where the gaps allowed it. Their steps echoed and then faded like they were being swallowed. At the end, They knocked on Kageyama's door. 3 times. Not hard, just enough. The door opened. Kageyama stood there with his usual straight back. His eyes were calm. "We want to come back at night with Mama," Dravka said. "With a lantern. We want to tell you a story." "Please," Yar added. Kageyama looked at them each in turn, his gaze steady. A small smile touched his face. "All right, I'll be here." They ran home the same way. Slava had already set the lamp on the table by the time they came back in. They did their last small chores without being told. A few pieces of hay brought in from the step, a shoe moved from the doorway, a bucket put where it belonged. When the sun dropped and the road went pale, they lit the lantern. Slava took one more look at each of them and nodded. They walked to the tunnel together this time. The light from the lantern made a clean circle on the ground. It shook a little with each of Dravka's steps. Yar stayed just off her shoulder. Slava walked behind them, holding the strap of her bag with one hand. She had not expected to see anyone but Kageyama. She had never heard even a rumor that others lived here. They reached the inner door, knocked once. The door opened almost at once. Rachel stood there first. Even in the doorway she seemed to fill the space. 6'3", and the long face that made her look taller still. Black cut-off shirt with frayed seams, black jean shorts, bare feet. Her hair was white, not thin, full and white. Her eyes were dark and steady, the kind that saw more than most people said out loud. Silas stood a step behind her, same clothes as her, black cut-off shirt, black jean shorts, barrel chest, strong building. He didn't move much. He didn't need to. Kageyama was there as well, back straight as always. He looked the same as he always did, old and not old, like time had decided to sit down in him rather than take anything away. None of them looked weak. None of them moved like old people. Their eyes had that look some very old people have, the kind that comes from years, but there was nothing slow in them. It made Slava feel unsteady for a moment, like she had stepped into a place where things didn't work the same way. "Come," Kageyama said. He led them to the jade staircase. They walked the wide jade steps. The platform at the top was smooth and clean. They all sat cross-legged. Slava sat with the children between her and the edge. Rachel sat across from Dravka. Silas took a place by Kageyama's right hand, back straight, hands loose on his knees. The lantern went in the center. Its light was enough. No one spoke for a few breaths. The horses could be heard far away, soft and even. The trees held their own sound, the way they always did here. It felt safe and a little strange at the same time. "This is the story of the lantern owl," Dravka said. She said it plain, not like a performance, like she was reporting what she had seen. She told it as it had happened, the run to the platform at night, the size of it far off, small as a thumbnail at arm's length, one large light in the center, 6 smaller in a ring, the streak of orange and pink pulled long behind it, with bright sparks inside the streak, like something burning that didn't burn out. How it hung there without sound, how it stayed without moving, how it disappeared in a single flash, as if it had gone into a hole in the air. Then the empty place where it had been. The way it made the night feel like it was still thinking, even after it left. She used simple words. She didn't dress it up. Yar took over. He said what he had said then, that owls don't fly with their young, that the colors looked wrong for the forest, that nothing in the woods burns like that. He said it the same way he had said it before, even voice, slow. He didn't look to Rachel or Silas for approval. He just said it. Dravka added the thing about the eyes. How animal eyes glow in lantern light. How this looked like that, only in a circle. How it felt like it was looking back. That's why we call it the lantern owl, Dravka said, like a metal owl with lights. Or like a lantern with different flames inside, Yar said, but the flames are eyes. He leaned forward, like lightning branching out. Dravka caught it. And from those branches, berries, Yar grinned. What if in spring the lantern owl grows more eyes, like berries on a branch? They looked at each other, the idea catching between them. Branch into branch, berry into berry, eye into eye, until it felt to them like they had stumbled onto something important. All four adults, Rachel, Silas, Kageyama, and even Slava, laughed quietly. Not at them, but with them. Rachel glanced once at Kageyama, and he at Silas, a quick, wordless check that passed as fast as it came. They kept their eyes on the flame while they spoke. It helped to say it straight. Kageyama was the first to speak. This is a great gift, he said, for the forest to show this only to you two. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen such gifts before. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her finger pointing toward the far edge of the platform. Right there? She asked, like she could almost see it now. Dravka nodded. Right there. Silas's eyes moved to the same spot. He said nothing, but the shape of it was in his mind, too precise to be only a child's invention. The three of them, Rachel, Silas, Kageyama, had no doubt the children were not telling a story they had made up. The detail, the order, the way their voices held no performance. It was the kind of truth that was not learned from books, something the forest had only shown them. In their own minds, other shapes moved. Not the lantern owl, but the tall, mottled-skinned blues, their surface carrying that strange, translucent robin's egg blue wash over a base of light dove gray, finger joints like knots, fingers far longer than they should be. Each of the three had once woken in the night to find one standing before them, close enough to see the tilt of its head, the way one long finger stayed tucked into its palm while the other two rose toward the side of the head. The fingers never touched right away. There was a resistance in the air, like the push of two magnets held with the same poles facing, holding apart for several seconds. They didn't know what it was, only that it seemed to wrap the head itself. Then, without warning, that unseen barrier collapsed and the fingertips pressed to the temple. And each time that was the moment they woke fully. Kageyama's gaze stayed on the children. When you saw it, he asked, did the air feel like it was holding still, even inside you? Dravka thought. A little, she said. Like the trees stopped for a second. Yar nodded, like waiting for something to happen. Rachel's eyes stayed on the lantern. And the stillness, that was from the lantern owl? Both children nodded. Rachel's mouth moved in a small, almost smile. She knew the answer was more important than the question. Silas spoke next. We would love to hear more stories about the lantern owl. Let us know anytime. They stood. The lantern light shifted over the jade, down the wide steps. They walked the tunnel with the lantern held a little higher. The summer night met them at the outer door. The road was pale, quiet. They did not speak on the way home. In the kitchen the lantern went on the table. Slava blew it out. Rachel and Silas walked back, hand in hand on the night of the lantern owl story, their steps slow, Their faces turned toward each other. Like berries on a branch, Rachel said, giggling. Lightning branching out, Silas replied, and they both laughed, the sound carrying soft in the warm summer air. Kageyama's voice met them before the door. We are eating ramen. He almost never spoke this way, light in tone yet absolute in intent. Moments like this came rarely, and only when it mattered to him. It carried the quiet warmth of a father telling his children what came next. The summer heat fell away when the door closed. Inside, the jade walls kept their own season, air dense and unmoving, colder than it had any right to be, the kind that settles in the bones and listens. Rachel and Silas sat next to each other, Kageyama on the other side of the jade slab table preparing the ramen. The silence held for minutes, unbroken, and none of them strained beneath it. Waiting was natural to all three. Then, without looking up, Kageyama said, I have grown tired of the lantern owls. He glanced at them, the smallest smile opening across his face. Rachel and Silas both smiled back, their laughter low but warm. And the ants as tall as men, he added, the faintest upward tilt in his voice. They laughed again, the sound breaking into the dim light. Almost together, Rachel and Silas answered, the ones who crawl around inside the lantern. Kageyama looked up, eyes meeting theirs for a heartbeat. Yes. They all chuckled lightly, but the humor dissolved as his gaze settled again. I will no longer permit myself to wonder, he said. It is my duty to know all that can be known of the blues. His eyes lingered on them in silence, a look without heat, but with the unspoken weight of a promise he would not abandon, no matter what it required. The words pressed into the corners of the room. Rachel and Silas felt the truth in them, knew that when he gave himself to a purpose, the earth itself might shift to make room for it. The blues had turned their eyes toward Dravka and Yar. That alone was enough to anchor this in all their minds. They ate without speaking, slurping their ramen, the smell filling the room. Rachel bit into a boiled egg. The memory came back as if it had happened an hour ago. Though 60 years had passed, the sound of the steel slicing through flesh twice and then the two heavy thuds of meat striking the stone floor almost immediately after. Her eyes misted, not from the broth's heat, but from the memory alive in her even now. She turned away, letting it pass before it could linger. Kageyama remained where he had always been, not just across from them at the table, but between them and the dark. The protector. Morning spread across the night like a gentle breeze, carrying nothing but peace. The door of the jade mansion opened with its heavy weight, and the colder air within slipped out into the day. Rachel and Silas stepped through, the stone at their backs giving way to morning. At the edge of the jade slabs, a car waited, its shape stark against the stone. No machine belonged here. Its metal caught the light in a way the stone never did, a glare foreign to this place. It was not Kageyama's. He didn't own a car. When he required one, it appeared, then vanished again without trace. Rachel and Silas knew Dravka and Yar had only ever glimpsed such things a few times in their lives. To see one now was to feel the world intruded upon, something unnatural standing where it did not belong. Kageyama stood beside it. He did not lean against the body of the machine, nor glance toward it, as though refusing to grant it place. His hands rested at his sides, posture straight but unforced, carrying a stillness that pressed into the air around him. When they approached, he inclined himself, no more than a faint bow, but enough to mark respect. They answered in kind. Rachel lowered her head, Silas following, the exchange of silence more binding than words. Their eyes met his. The knowing passed between them without explanation. He would be gone, weeks, months, vanished into distances they could not follow. The car door was held open. He stepped toward it with no hurry, as though time itself moved at his pace. The bow lingered in their bodies even after he had turned, even as he disappeared inside. The machine pulled away without sound, swallowed by the forest road. Rachel and Silas walked up the staircase to the platform. It was what they did every day, to stand at its height and look across the crowns of the trees, the birds diving in and out of them. The forest moved in slow breath beneath. They stood together on the platform and watched the sun rise. They started to feel the heat. Rachel said quietly, "It's going to get hot." Been a few years, they both decided they would spend the day walking to the river. They walked back. She went inside and came back with her backpack, and in her hands the big glass jar and the brush. The birch tar inside was black and thick like molasses. They took off their clothes. Rachel painted the birch tar over their shorts and shirts. When the work was done, they dressed again. The birch tar was to repel mosquitoes that would be unbearable near the river this time of year. Rachel's shashka hung at her side, its wooden sheath brushing her thigh as she moved. Silas left his shoes at the door. The ground was warm beneath his feet, the kind of warmth that felt alive. They set out. They walked hand in hand, both barefoot, taking their time. It felt like the walk would last forever. That was the point, sharing it all. The leaves glowed bright green under the sun, and a gentle breeze would shoot a quick golden ray through the canopy like a wink at their love. Walked for hours, stopping only to drink water, or for Rachel to cut a path through the brush with her sword when the forest grew too dense. It was a special day, a rare day. Rachel had only a few memories of this kind of warmth. It was almost 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and they were just north of the Arctic Circle. It felt like her birthday, and they both smelled like candles that had just been blown out. They knew they were close. Countless bright green dragonflies seemed to grow in number with every step, large metallic streaks appearing out of nowhere, as if they were stepping into a dream. They walked for a few more hours. Rachel looked over at Silas and smiled. The birch tar kept the mosquitoes off, but they were still thick in the air and had grown steady with the dragonflies. They stepped out of the forest and into the light, their feet now finding the hot grip of rocks. They could both feel it in their chests, a low, distant thunder, the Yenisei. They sat down on the edge of the river in the wet sand, cooling their feet in the current. Rachel took some dried meat from her backpack, and they ate in silence. They drank from their water devices and rested, just sitting there, watching the river. The current, the Yenisei, moving like molten glass, heavy as a lava flow, slow as breath. Rachel stood and set her shashka aside. Then she stripped, and Silas did too. Together they walked slowly into the side channel and began to swim against the gentle current, stopping just before the river braided into the main flow, letting it bring them back to where they started again and again. Sometimes they let the current carry them on their backs, looking up at the green dragonflies hovering just above. Other times they raced each other back, taking breaks on a sandbar so wide you couldn't have thrown a stone across to the main channel, pausing only long enough to warm themselves before returning again to the water. The birch tar that had leached through their clothes from the heat and sweat of the long walk had soaked deep into their skin, and even after swimming, The scent of it still clung to them. The river had done little to wash it away. It usually lasted for days. They hadn't needed to put their clothes back on. They lay on their backs, side by side on the sandbar. "Read a poem for me," Rachel said. Silas was somewhere else, in the ghost world. She sat up, placed her hand on his chest, straightened his pendant, and smiled. Her face hovered above him, glowing faintly in the endless twilight, lit by the dim northern glow that never faded, as if the world itself refused to sleep. She repeated herself, softer this time. "Silas, read me a poem." His face broke immediately into a smile. "Let's write one together," he said. Rachel had her moments. "You look," she said slowly, running her finger from his nose down to his stomach, her eyes narrowing as if lost in thought, pausing for effect. She exhaled sharply, blowing air into his face and laughing, half cackle, half song. "Like my birthday wish," she said, barely able to speak through her laughter. "Yes," he said, smiling. He laughed as hard as she did. "You too," he started, "but I'd say smell." Before he could finish, they were both caught in laughter again. The sound carried over the pale water, bouncing between the rock outcrops as if the river itself were laughing back. Somewhere far off, an owl called once, brief and low, then fell silent again. When Silas could breathe, he managed to finish, "Like my birthday wish." When it finally grew quiet again, the laughter lingered in their expressions. Then Silas spoke. "Through her eyes her soul shines. Thief, all I can see is your face, blinded, with no heart." Rachel moved suddenly, swinging her leg over him as she rose to her knees, kneeling above him with her long legs parted, his waist between them. The faint northern light slid across her face like frost. "Yeah," she said, "I'm a thief." He looked up at her. In that moment she looked monumental. Under the sleepless sky, her pale skin seemed to hold its own glow, and he always thought she looked like a marble statue brought to life, one carrying the weight of their love. Somewhere behind them a low ripple moved through the water, slow and deliberate, then faded. "You sure it's your birthday?" "Not mine," he said, his face barely able to keep a straight expression, his voice carrying it too. "Yeah," she said, shifting forward, sitting fully on him now. Her movement slow, deliberate, the air between them heavy. The river moved around them, slow and endless, like breath. Silas woke to the sun piercing his eye. He was spooning Rachel, his arm draped over her stomach, her head tilted slightly toward him, her ear caught softly in the hollow beside his eye. He kissed it, barely awake. Rachel's lips broke into a smile, her eyes still closed. "Good morning," she whispered, her voice dry from sleep. She moved her hips, slow and steady, nestling herself against him until they joined. The faint scent of birch still clung to their skin. They made love again, quiet and unhurried. Afterward, Silas turned away from the sun, and Rachel followed. She curled against his back, her arm sliding over his chest. They slept another hour as the sun kept climbing. When they woke again, the light had shifted, bright, severe, the air already thick with heat. Today's wind was stronger. They sat together and watched the dragonflies, listening to the trees, the familiar applause of leaves in the wind. Silas stood first. They swam again, then ate the last of the dried meat. Afterward they dressed and began the long walk back. When they reached the mansion, they stripped off their clothes, balled them up, and tossed them aside, away from the heavy door. They entered. Rachel leaned her sword against the wall just inside. They showered together, the brushes and bar soap scraping away the river and the birch tar, and shampooed their hair. When they finished, they went into their room, not bothering to light a candle before closing the door. They knew the path by heart, a straight walk, so many steps, then the bed. The room went pitch black when the door closed. Silas's fingers lightly touched Rachel's back as she walked ahead, her longer stride guiding them through the dark. They sank into the bed and slept the rest of the day. The walk had been long and hot, but they were happy. They didn't make love every day. They let it build naturally. Yesterday had been a special day, a rare day. Their room was cold. They liked it that way. The following months passed in a gentle stride, casting, riding horses, wordless walks, countless hours in their room, not knowing how much time had passed while holding each other, lying on their backs, looking at the sky, making love. Time always passed slowly for them. Their early lives had shaped their minds in ways that didn't change. They never stopped appreciating, never stopped loving, an impossible kind of certainty, one that few who have lived ever come to know. Months felt like an eternity in their solitude, but it was a slow, savored eternity, quiet, content, and alive. Then one cold day, when most of the leaves had fallen from the birch trees, Dravka and Yar came knocking. The sound carried clearly through the stone corridors, echoing through the empty space between the walls. After a minute they arrived at the door and opened it. Yar spoke first, excited and breathless from running all the way. "We saw the lantern owl." "Really?" "The forest has shown you the lantern owl twice," Rachel said. Dravka leaned in close, her eyes bright, her face lit with the expression of someone who had solved a riddle that no one else could. "It had the same number of berries," she said. Yar jumped in, voice exploding with excitement. "So it has to be the same lantern owl. Berries would have grown in spring or summer. Same branch, same berries, same lantern owl." Dravka and Yar high-fived loud and sharp, eyes wide, grinning from ear to ear. Rachel and Silas exchanged a glance. "How did a couple of kids figure that out?" Silas said, just loud enough for them to hear. Rachel's eyes smiled. "Did you see the lantern owl in the same place, over there?" she asked, pointing toward the staircase and the 2 stone pillars outside. Both children shook their heads slowly, eyes even wider now. "No," they said together, laughing. Mid-laugh, still out of breath, they blurted, "We saw it a few minutes ago," before collapsing into giggles again. Rachel and Silas looked at each other, eyes narrowing slightly. After a few moments, when the laughter finally slowed, Dravka stepped forward. Rachel knelt to meet her at eye level. "Where?" Rachel asked quietly. Dravka spoke fast, the words tumbling out. "Well, we were out in the field talking about the lantern owl, watching the sky like we always do at night, and then it just appeared. But it was lower." "Closer," Yar broke in. "Way closer. It's huge, like a lake." Rachel's eyes flicked to Silas. "You know how leaves float on water?" Dravka asked. "Yes," Rachel said. "Then it drifted like that, like a leaf in the wind, floating." Yar laughed. "So we ran after it." "You saw this a few minutes ago?" Silas asked, his voice suddenly sharp, concerned. "We ran after it. We chased it here and watched it die. It threw up, then disappeared. But this time we think it's really dead. Probably doesn't live long anyway." Being that big, Dravka's tone was matter of fact, almost proud of the discovery. "It vomited and died," Rachel said, her mouth half open, letting out a small startled laugh. "Why do you say that?" "Why do you think it vomited and died?" Silas asked. "Well, the lightning fell out of its belly," Dravka said simply. "Then it disappeared into its hole again." For a long moment no one spoke. The room seemed to hold its breath, The air between the stone walls felt thicker now, as if the house itself had listened. Silas and Rachel thanked them both for coming to tell them about the lantern owl's death. Then they closed the door. The latch clicked like a final word. They went back to their room and sat beside each other, unsure what to think. Would it come back? Was it ever real? Was this night the one the forest would claim something from them? Their heads spun with questions that found no place to rest. Silas raised his hands and ran his fingers over Rachel's face, tracing her features like a map, kissing her nose, her eyes, her mouth. She did the same to him, her eyes glossy, her expression blank with the quiet fear of what might happen if the blues came back. Then they smelled it. They sprinted to the kitchen, half mad, following the scent. Kageyama was frying gyoza. When they turned the corner, he was trying not to laugh, his lips pressed tight, the corners trembling. Then it broke out of him, a deep, full laugh that filled the room, spreading across his face like sunlight after storm clouds. At first they didn't speak, they just watched him, Kageyama, still laughing as he turned the dumplings in the pan, the oil hissing softly. The sound filled the room, small, ordinary, almost sacred after the terror of moments before. The smell of gyoza drifted through the air, sharp and real. They stared, as if their eyes alone might hold him there. For a few minutes no one moved. Only the soft rhythm of frying and his quiet breathing broke the silence. Kageyama picked up a brush, dipping it in a small ceramic bowl half full with soy sauce, black like ink, and painted each dumpling with a single, quick, and masterful stroke, the soy glistening faintly under the light. Not a drop touched the plate. "Coffee," he said. "Yeah," they both answered, almost at the same time. It wasn't just agreement, it was the sound of two people catching their breath after fear. A single word, stretched long, more relief than reply. The "ya" carried a grin beneath it, a quiet admission that he'd scared them good, his only trick in all the years they'd known him. They were certain, and were correct in thinking Kageyama had heard the second lantern owl story as well. They were proud he hadn't given away his position by laughing. It had been near dusk when Dravka and Yar came knocking. There had been nothing but clouds today, heavy and low, pressing against the horizon. Whatever had appeared in the sky, the lantern owl, the saucer, had been flying beneath them. Now it was long gone. Night had settled fully. It was pitch black outside. This time of year, in this part of the world, darkness came heavy and whole. No wind moved through the trees, no applause from the leaves, just stillness. Kageyama slid the plate between them. The sound of ceramic against the jade table scraped through the quiet like a cruel whisper. Still smiling, he began to make the coffee, his movements unhurried. They all ate as it brewed. Kageyama poured the coffee. They drank in silence, the warmth spreading through them, slow and steady. When Kageyama finally saw that they had found their bearings again, he spoke. "Come with me." The calm in his voice was absolute. His smile faded, slow and clean, like the lantern owl returning to its hole in the sky, vanishing. They rose, the taste of gyoza still lingering on their tongues, warm, savory. Kageyama stepped toward the door, and they followed, slow at first, as if still waking from something. They hadn't quite put everything together, but they both knew. The lantern owl vomiting light, the lightning falling from its belly. Something had been transferred, beamed up or down, or scanned. And Kageyama's arrival could only mean one thing. He had ridden the light itself back down, calm, unafraid, like a man who knew the road he'd taken. He hadn't been taken by force. He'd hitched a ride, and somehow the light had carried him home. Neither of them spoke. It was as if saying it aloud might break the spell. Kageyama was only a few steps from the door when the knocks came. 3 measured blows, heavy but controlled. They all heard what followed, but for Silas, it struck deeper. A memory stirred, old and half buried, from long before he met Rachel, like a ghost rising. Kageyama opened the door, a voice, familiar, impossible. He'd outlived everyone he had ever known. Why is that voice familiar, he thought. The cadence of it, the slow, dull drag of each word, like thick fabric tearing slowly across rough concrete, each bump catching, fraying, pulling it apart. The weight behind every pause. That rhythm, who is this? Kageyama, just want to talk. Another pause. The same pause he remembered, a cadence only one person had ever carried. Who was that? Then, after the silence stretched too long to bear, the voice spoke again. It's all right. They stood still for a long moment after the voice faded. Then Silas moved, instinct maybe, stepping in front of both Rachel and Kageyama. Kageyama's expression almost made him laugh despite the tension. It was the kind of face a child makes when caught sneaking an extra dessert. But Silas's blood was pumping. He reached for the handle and turned it slowly. The hinges creaked. He opened the door halfway, just enough to see, but not enough to be seen. A man stood outside, close enough that the light caught the insignia on his chest. He was about the same size as Silas, broad-shouldered, posture unmistakable. It had been a long time, uniforms change, but enough remained for Silas to recognize it. A United States Navy uniform. His eyes drifted down to the name stitched across the chest. Rames. He looked so much like his grandfather that for a moment Silas thought it was him. It took a few seconds for the likeness to fade, the memory rising, then breaking apart, until he saw it wasn't him at all, only the echo of his grandfather's face. As if reading his thoughts, the man spoke. I know, he said, his voice calm, steady, familiar in a way that made the hair rise on Silas's arms. I sound like him too. He paused, then added, my grandfather. A warm smile spread across his face as he extended his hand. Silas took it. The grip was firm, practiced. We thought you'd be more comfortable if I came, Rames said. We know who you are. Don't sweat it. Silas blinked, unsure what to say. Rames went on, the faintest humor in his voice. I love my grandfather's movies. But my favorite, Men of Honor. You like the new uniforms? He raised his arms slightly, turning them out for display, the fabric whispering, as if reading his earlier thoughts about the uniforms. Seal? Silas asked. Something like that, Rames said, the corner of his mouth lifting. Then his eyes shifted. Kageyama. The tone changed, respectful, but firm enough to command a room. Silas instinctively stepped aside. Kageyama moved forward, face still carrying that guilty, boyish look that seemed out of place on him. Rames studied him for a long moment. The silence deepened. Rachel and Silas exchanged a glance. Uneasy, almost fascinated. Kageyama looked like a child that got caught stealing candy. Tomorrow? Kageyama muttered at last, half question, half plea. Then all three saw it, a flash, sharp and sudden, a memory that wasn't theirs. Rames standing in a museum, staring at the growth crown behind glass. Their heads snapped at once, eyes locking on him. He knew. Somehow he knew exactly what they'd seen. Tomorrow night, Rames said quietly. He gave a single nod to them all. Then he made a fist, the call sign. Kageyama is going to have a long conversation about age with you two, he said quickly. Light swallowed him whole. Brilliant, soundless, absolute. and in a blink he was gone. After Rames left, before a word could come from Rachel or Silas, Kagayama moved past them, leaving the door wide open with a stride more like a dance than a walk. After, he said, walking excitedly away from the mansion. They followed. He led them up the long stairway that ran between the two square jade pillars, their remains now within the roots that had long grown around them, feeling through vibration every wind, every cold. The massive larches at their sides rose directly from the tops of the pillars, broad jade block planters now fused with living wood, mostly bare, only a few yellow needles still clinging to their branches, looking like great wolf spiders poised to dart away at any moment. The few lingering yellow needles made them look poisonous in the dim light. When they reached the platform, the air was motionless. The clouds hung low, pressing down like a ceiling, their edges bruised with dim light. The jade beneath their bare feet was as cool as their bones, both the ones they carried and the ones buried below. The silence was so deep it seemed to hum faintly, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Then the veil tore. The lantern owl appeared just ahead of them, no more than a few strides away, hovering slightly above eye level. It was no wider than a small house, close enough that its light grazed their faces. The metal seemed alive, lit from within, its glow breathing through the surface like embers beneath glass. 6 pale orbs circled just inside the craft's rim, each one hovering above a shallow half-sphere, hollowed into the metal but never touching, held perfectly still, half within, half free, suspended in their own faint fields of light. The central curve of light was different, deeper, like a pane of translucent glass shaped into a lens. It pulsed slowly, as if watching or waiting. The lantern owl turned, slow and deliberate, like the feeling of turning over a rock to find insects beneath. Its belly faced them fully now. The disturbingly simple structure, brighter than before, was laid bare in full clarity. Now they felt like the insects ready to scatter under sudden light, and then, with a sudden shudder, it threw up its lightning. They were enveloped in light. They could see out from within it now, as though the walls could be looked through but not into. A dozen questions spilled from Rachel and Silas at once, but Kageyama only said it again. After, before breaking into laughter. That day they heard him laugh more than they had in the past 20 years combined. They loved him for it, and let him keep the answers until it was time. The ceiling and floor glowed with a faint, indifferent light, soft enough not to draw the eye unless you looked for it. It was like standing in the sky itself. They felt no motion, no pull, only the stillness as the world below began to drift away. It wasn't speed they sensed, but distance growing, slow, silent, absolute. Then it stopped. They were staring at the earth, small and bright, about the size of the pot that hung above Rachel's wood-burning stove, hanging there in front of them. No one spoke for minutes. Then Kageyama did. "What do you see?" he asked. "Life," Silas said. "River stone," Rachel whispered, eyes wide with wonder. They moved again, effortless, blindingly fast, to the far side of the earth, holding the same distance. "What do you see?" Kageyama asked once more. "Darkness," Rachel said. Silas nodded. The ship shifted again, much quicker this time. In a blink, they stood the same distance from the sun. The light should have destroyed them, yet it didn't. Nothing dimmed, no shield appeared. The brilliance surrounded them, but somehow did not burn. "What do you see?" Kageyama asked again. "Life," Silas said. Rachel smiled in agreement, her eyes fixed on the enormous bursts of fire, great tongues of flame unraveling and folding back into themselves, each movement calm, ancient, alive. Then it happened again. A blink, blackness. They didn't glide this time. They snapped through the dark. When light returned, they were only a few feet away from something impossible. A boy kneeling in the dust, playing with the Japanese rhinoceros beetle. It was Kageyama. "What do you see?" he asked again. Neither spoke. Their eyes were wide, the realization rising slow and cold. They weren't moving through space anymore. They were moving through time. "Memory," Kageyama said softly, his voice low and tender. Another blink. Darkness. Then they were back where they'd started, staring at Earth once more. The oceans and clouds turning slowly in daylight below. Kageyama. He was the father they'd always wanted. And they, the children he had always wished for. He spoke then. "How you both were brought back. The resonance displacement cubes, remember?" They nodded. "These craft are like the cubes." He paused, letting it settle. Then he went on, filling them in on what he'd learned. "In the entire universe, only the blues make these." He smiled faintly. "Lantern owls," he said. Slowly the craft began to move again, its motion unsettling in its silence. They felt no pull, no force, but everything shifted around them. Planets shrank, galaxies bloomed, then multiplied. Thousands, millions, each one unfolding like a living map. They stopped there. "It," he said, pausing, "gets strange." Another pause. "Further out." They took his word for it. All three of them stared out at the endless galaxies. Silent tears rolled down their faces. For minutes, maybe hours, they could never remember. "This is one of theirs," he said quietly. "The blues. The Navy can reverse the tech. It's very simple if you have the money. But they can do little with it. You can't change the past. You can only watch, and few can operate them. Many have died trying. Their minds can't hold what they see. They always go too far. They can't resist it. It takes discipline and a certainty that only people with processing issues." He paused. "Or very old people can possess," he said. They had known it from the start, from the way he'd arrived, the way the light itself seemed to move with him. The craft answered his thoughts before he spoke. Rachel didn't need to understand how. She'd grown up far from machines. But she could feel it, the link between him and the lantern owl. They both remembered the comment Rames had made about the conversation they would have about age. The craft began to turn, drifting back toward where they'd come from. "You saw there's no seams or rivets?" he asked. They nodded. "Only the original crafts have no rivets," Kageyama said. "Why?" Rachel asked before Silas could. "They make them with their minds," he said. Both of them exhaled softly in surprise. "See the lights on the bottom?" Kageyama said. "Hovering in their sockets, not connected?" "Yes," they said together. "Like the sun hovers in the sky," Kageyama said slowly. Rachel and Silas exchanged a look. They understood now what he had been preparing them for earlier. "You will never see any of this again," Kageyama said, his tone shifting, his face solemn, fatherly. He looked at them as if reminding them to take it all in. They were still moving slowly now, and the wonders that passed around them were beyond words. They simply stared, breathless. "One side of the earth is dark," Kageyama said softly. "The other light." They turned to him. "Visible and invisible," he went on. "Life and death." He paused again. "We are all standing on the jade platform and standing here at once. The origin of the resonance still connected to it. And when we leave this place, we'll become visible again." He gave a small smile. "Right where we were." They all chuckled quietly, the sound drifting like a faint echo through the boundless dark. Kagayama stopped the craft in front of a planet so close it filled their entire field of view. A living furnace. Massive volcanoes erupted across the surface, rivers of molten rock running like veins of fire. One volcano towered above the rest, so vast Silas thought it must be the size of Australia. Planet still forming, Silas said, not realizing he'd spoken aloud. Kageyama brought the craft to a halt, hovering above the great volcano's mouth, no more than a mile up. He looked over at them. He knew they liked dragons. So did he. As they watched the lava churn below, he spoke quietly. The flash we all saw, the glimpse of memory, Rames in the museum. They nodded, eyes still fixed on the molten glow. That grows stronger with age, Kageyama said. Our species only lives so long. We were never supposed to have this technology. That's why we can't do much with it, except travel and see the past. Rachel's voice cut in. What else could you do with it? She asked, almost childlike in her excitement. Catch an asteroid heading for Earth, he said, smiling. Use the lightning to move it. Put it somewhere else, like here Silas looked down and saw it now. The volcano, now turned into a vast impact crater in his mind. The words had barely left his mouth. In an instant, they were back above Earth. They hovered in silence, the planet gleaming below. Kageyama turned to them, his expression softened. You need to see this, he said gently. Then we have to stop. They both knew it was something from the past. They could feel it. Kageyama drew 2 needles from his pocket. Lorazepam, they remembered. When they had been brought back all those years ago, he had done the same. Steady hands and a calm voice. They didn't move, didn't resist. He was their father. They trusted him completely. They barely felt the injection. They stared at the planet as minutes passed. After nearly 10, Kageyama spoke again, slower now. I can't explain it, he said. I can only show you. My only guess is that it's because you were brought back. I sensed it a few weeks ago. I was drawn here every time I left Earth, until I found it. This memory pulled to it. The blues have sifted through my mind twice since I found it. Never that close together before, he hesitated. I woke as I always do, but the barrier wasn't there anymore. Their finger touched my temple immediately. He looked worried. They weren't sneaking, he said finally. Something in his tone made the air in the cabin feel thinner. Rachel and Silas exchanged a glance. Show us, Rachel said. Silas nodded. It's okay. Truth is stranger than fiction, Kageyama said, his voice calm but heavy. You should both probably sit down. Kageyama's gaze drifted toward them, unreadable. They obeyed. The world blinked out for a split second, black, soundless, and then returned. Rachel gasped first. It's the hot day, she whispered. She and Silas were sitting naked on the sandbar. They weren't embarrassed, not in front of Kageyama. He was their father, in all the ways that mattered. They watched themselves from above, from the still interior of the lantern owl. The 2 of them, Rachel and Silas, sat on the sandbar beside the Yenisei, the current moving like molten glass, heavy and slow as lava. Rock outcrops lined the banks, broken only once where the forest touched the water. That narrow opening was the only way in and the only way out. There was nowhere to run. The outcrops rose high and smooth, impossible to climb, cutting off escape on both sides for many miles. Behind them the Yenisei ran colder than the side channel, its faster current certain death long before they could find anywhere to climb out. This was the same place where Rachel had found her snowstone, the one now around her neck, her little bronze ghost. The sandbar and the rocky shore, those were all they had. Near the far end of the sandbar, under the leaning trees, lay their clothes and Rachel's backpack. The cubs appeared first, 2 young males, nearly grown, both tearing at Rachel's pack. The jar of birch tar had shattered when the pack ripped and fell hard against the rocks, its black syrup spilling into the dried meat. They chewed once, twice, then froze. Both spat it out, snapping their heads side to side, pawing at the ground, making short, high whines that built into something raw and sharp. That was the sound that broke through first. They all watched, the Silas and Rachel of memory, turning from the sound, just as the mother burst through the forest break. She stopped over the torn pack, head low, nostrils flaring. The Yenisei had done little to wash the birch tar from their skin. The smell clung for days. Her head snapped toward them the instant the cubs cried again. It came to them all, in the craft, in the memory, instantly. They were both about as big as her, about 3 years old, males. She's in the later stage of driving them off before beginning the new mating season. Torn between motherly instincts and mating urges, restless, aggressive. The white nights, the endless day, had fooled them into staying by her side a little too long. They had prepared for this. That was why Rachel carried a shashka. In the decades since, Silas had never used his pistol once and had stopped carrying it, relying on Rachel and her sword as more than enough. The pistol reminded him of America. He hated it, and she knew it. The silence felt alive, like even Kagayama had forgotten to breathe. Rachel's hand found Silas's in the craft, almost the same instant it had long ago on that sandbar. Her knuckles were white. Kagayama showing them this on the hot day, their special day, that rare day. Being injected could only mean one thing, but how, Silas thought. They watched Rachel and Silas on the sandbar turn to look at each other as the mother bear plunged into the water. Just for a few seconds. No kiss. They were survivors, and they were both naked. Silas exhaled sharply as Rachel ran, diving over the mother just as she began stepping onto the sandbar, coming out of the water. Silas rose slowly, knowing Rachel needed her sword, and a little time. He couldn't do half of what she could with it. They watched Silas quickly scoop a handful of sand and throw it straight into the bear's eyes right as she climbed fully onto the sandbar, starting to sprint again, then dove. Not over like Rachel, but out to the side. Right before Silas pierced the water, they heard a sound that told them no trick or movement would ever get past this bear again. They had made it off the sandbar. That was all. The focus required to make it past her demanded tunnel vision, utter focus. When he rose at the stony beach, Rachel was already jogging backward toward him. The 2 cubs, if you could call them that, each around 500 pounds, were bellowing and moaning. The sword lay behind them. The mother bear was already furious, driven by instinct, her focus absolute. Silas bent down, seized a rock heavy enough to strain both arms, and threw it with everything left in him. It struck her across the muzzle with a dull, bone-deep sound, staggering her just long enough for him to grab another boulder. They watched Rachel look over her shoulder at him and the mother. She had seen it before he did. The next stone big enough to even register with that bear was too far away. Before he had time to throw it, Rachel sprinted, diving between the cubs toward the sword. One swatted her mid-air, spinning her as she fell, claws tearing into her thigh. Blood poured instantly, her skin opening in strips like ribbons. She hit the ground hard, her hand closing on the shashka's hilt. She slashed wildly, desperately. She made contact a few times before one bit her ankle, the other her shoulder, and pulled. The bears tore into her, chaos, motion, and blood, the sand erupting beneath their struggle, until her rib cage was open like a book, ribs jutting at odd angles, tangled like a nest of branches. Before Rachel had landed after being swatted, Silas had thrown the second rock. The mother was already bolting toward him. It hit her shoulder, having no effect. As she rose to stand, Silas charged her, trying to shoulder her chest in a desperate attempt to knock her off balance. It jostled her, that was all. She almost immediately caught him, bit his shoulder, and shook violently, then bit his head, then neck, shaking violently again. From the lantern owl, the three of them watched in silence, their faces pale, unmoving. They couldn't move. They couldn't look away as his body went limp. Rachel's breathing hitched, a reflex. Then, from the tree line, two figures appeared, tall, thin, and mottled-skinned, the faint wash of translucent robin's egg blue shifting over them. The blues hovered a foot above the ground, invisible to any eye outside the craft. Rachel and Silas turned to Kageyama, their faces pale, eyes wide with a child's disbelief. His eyes turned back to the memory, the hot day, that rare day, reminding them to keep watching. They did. The mother's head lifted as if sensing something in the air. Her mouth hung open, blood streaming down her chin. She looked happy, if not for the horror around her. The blues drifted closer, silent, patient. Time began to rewind. The bears moved backward, their motions in reverse. Beneath the blues' hovering feet, like a great sheet lifting from the earth, the blood drew together, rising off the ground from between the rocks and off the bears' soaked fur. Rachel and Silas lifted from the sand, their bodies restored, the sword sliding back to its resting place near the bag. They watched it all reverse until they were on the sandbar once more. The backpack sealed, the broken jar reformed, whole again. The blues pulsed faintly, right as the cubs stepped onto the rocky shore, under the thick canopy just inside the forest's edge, where the mother was glowed. Then the blues, the cubs and the mother, all at once glowed bright, then vanished, everything stilled, as if time itself were listening. For a heartbeat, their glow painted the trees like underwater light. No one spoke. The silence of the craft pressed close, almost tender. Inside the lantern owl, Kageyama stood with his hands clasped, eyes low. Rachel and Silas stared, wordless. "We need rest," Kageyama said. Lightning struck, not the skies, but the kind that came when the lantern owl transferred them through light. A brief, blinding silence before arrival. The lantern owl vomited, gone the instant they arrived. Their feet were cold again on the jade platform. For a moment, none of them moved. They stood facing the darkness, the forest that had kept them for so many years. Not with breath, but inside their minds they exhaled. Their bodies felt different, lungs catching on the air as though it had grown thick. Kageyama's voice was steady, deliberate. "I will meet you here in the morning." A moment later, together they turned, slow, synchronized, as if the motion itself had been rehearsed. Walking back, bare feet whispering against the stone, the smell of pine sap and leaf rot following them down the path. Right before they reached the mansion, Rachel spoke softly for both of them. "Can you help us sleep?" Kageyama nodded. They waited outside their door while he went to retrieve it. When he returned, he injected them again with lorazepam, more this time. He bowed, so did they. Within 20 minutes they were both asleep. In his room, Kageyama sat for some time, looking out the window toward the forest, to the jade block planters, the larches towering out of them, the staircase. Then he injected himself, and sleep found him. In the morning, Rachel and Silas drank their coffee while she cooked. She made lumpia for breakfast, though hers were nearly 3 times the size of the usual kind, heavy on the cabbage and pork, using 2 wraps for each. The thin wrappers crisped and browned unevenly in the pan. The smell of them filled the room, warm and heavy, mixing with the drift of coffee. When they ate, dipping each roll into banana sauce, they watched each other the way they always had, as if no time had passed at all, as if their love had only just begun. By the time the plates were empty, the sky hung flat and colorless. A light snow was falling, covering the staircase until it looked more like a mountain. At the top, framed by the larches, Kageyama stood waiting. It wasn't cold enough yet for the heavy wool or the tall boots. Both belonged to the Arctic. For Rachel, it still wasn't cold enough for boots. She didn't own shoes. Silas's warmth carried into the open air, melting the first dust of snow as it touched him. They wore what they always did, black shorts, cut-off black shirts, and the silver fox fur hats Rachel had stitched by hand, meant only to keep their heads dry and the flakes from their eyes. They stepped out and moved toward the staircase. Kageyama waited above them in simple robes, a sable fur hat of her making, almost the same as theirs, but light brown to match his tan robes. The snow fell straight down. It layered over needles, light but certain. Each flake held its shape, slow enough to get a good look at, until it touched the ground. The air felt close, the kind that catches in the throat before you breathe it in. They walked with patience, taking it all in, the last bits of green soon to be hidden by bitter cold. They climbed the staircase. At the top, they stood beside Kageyama and waited. For a while, no one spoke. Kageyama finally said, almost to the air, "I thought rest would bring an answer. Why they brought you back. If they can do it at will, as we saw, it must be ordinary to them, easy. So what drew them? What was the trigger?" The snow whispered against jade. Rachel didn't answer. Silas didn't either. Kageyama's voice lowered. When Rames was near, the flash came. He has a powerful mind, relentless, focused, honorable. That's why we can sense him. When his thoughts are strong and he's close. When I held on while they were sifting through my mind, I knew they were older than a human mind can hold. We've talked about it. But I don't think distance matters to them, time either. Resonance does. And maybe I'm wrong, he said, eyes still lowered. I've been wrong before. Everything hums when it's called by name. When they pass through thought, it feels like magnetism, pull without touch. He looked down, like spiders feeling one tremor through a web. One tremor and they know where you are. Silas's breath fogged the air. Were you confused as blues? Kageyama asked, very soft now. Coded somehow when you were first brought back? Or something else? A brief, almost private smile crossed his face, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Were those 2 blues you? Rachel's mouth parted. Silas's hand tightened in hers. Both of them drew in a small breath. Don't worry, Kageyama said, lifting his chin. Do you want to die or keep loving each other? They both answered at once. Love. He nodded once. Then we live. Pills, plasma, whatever is needed. I can't see the future in the craft. He said it plainly as if naming the weather. Rachel smiled, a faint grin caught in her voice. We'll take as many pills as you give us. He let a small breath slip through his nose. A corner of his mouth moved. In the months I was gone, he said at last, I went everywhere a man can go by, knocking on the right doors, governments, rooms with no windows, blues, craft. Answers came quickly. Most of what they told me, I already suspected. I only asked to see if they'd lie. Wealth helps, but old friends help more. His gaze shifted to the blank air just beyond the platform's edge. The craft is here now. Invisible until I ask otherwise. Rachel and Silas stood a little straighter without meaning to. They watched it for years, Kageyama went on. There was a body coming, slow, certain, a couple 100 years. Out, they all knew. Governments kept it close. You don't tell the world its great-grandchildren will meet a stone. He paused. The craft we were in, it was an original, one of the blues. So far, I'm the only one who's managed to operate it. None of the Navy pilots can even locate the asteroid in the reversed craft. They're off by galaxies when they try to go out, but they can always make it home if they don't get drawn farther. He paused again, as if the faintest sound of ego repulsed him. I found it. Used the craft to seize it in light and relocate. Nothing more. Certainty. The asteroid was no less a burden than bringing you two into that craft with me. I searched for hours until I found a new forming planet and placed it close, so the planet's gravity would draw it in. They gave me a medal in private. They interrupted him with bright words of regard. He continued, smiling wide for him after his children had been impressed. Then, he said, smiling openly, I borrowed it a little too long. Reims came. There are only a few originals. They were getting nervous. Well, he said sharply but with warmth, we need to process what we saw last night, conquer it. We're going to the river. They took their time down the steps, then dressed for wind, not warmth. Old wool, thick cuffs, the kind that kept a moving cold from cutting the bone. Rachel buckled her shashka low on her hip. Kageyama came out carrying 3 12-gauge pumps slung over his shoulder, ones he had only recently acquired. He handed each of them one. Don't go past the wall without one, and a horse. The only rule he ever spoke. He looked at Rachel, pumped the shotgun once. She mirrored him. He set his stance, shouldered the butt, and fired into the sky. She followed. After a few quiet words, he reached into his coat and handed them each a few extra slugs to pocket. When they were ready, Rachel called out to the horses. From underneath the dark canopy, a herd came like remembered thoughts. Each found their own and mounted. They rode for the gate this time. Before, they'd only climbed the cubes and gone straight to the Yenisei. They used to walk for that reason, and because they enjoyed the walk. Now, on horseback, the long way would still get them there faster, they thought. At the beach, they dismounted and stood side by side for half an hour without a word. They replayed what they had seen and knew it was already behind them. The Yenisei moved like something asleep and dangerous. The dragonflies were gone. What had shimmered once was now still. The shore felt like iron. On the ride back, Rachel leaned across and spoke to Kageyama, voice too low for Silas to catch. He didn't turn to listen. He trusted them. It was enough to see the small smile pull at Kageyama's mouth and be done with it. When they reached the property's edge, they dismounted. The horses had given enough. They watched Kageyama climb the stone steps, careful and deliberate, then watched as the lantern owl appeared and loosed its lightning. Less than 3 hours later, they returned him in a reversed craft. The Navy pilots were experts using them on Earth, nothing more. A knock came some minutes after, soft, 2 beats. When Rachel opened their door, no one stood there. Kageyama was already walking back down the hall. A small bag rested on the stone. Follow me, she whispered to Silas, smiling like someone holding back a joke. They went to the bathroom. Rachel untied the bag. 2 black bottles. She shook the bottles. Black hair paint, she said, pleased with the sound. Over the years, they had watched a few movies together in Kageyama's chamber. Rarely, but she had seen women with dyed hair before, though she still called it hair paint. She stripped and sat in the shower, and he did the same. Rachel parted his white hair with her fingers. Long, sure, the way she handled a horse's mane, and began. The smell rose, sharp, chemical, foreign. When she finished him, she did her own. The dye ran like ink along her spine. The room smelled faintly of something new and a little dangerous. They would be stained for a week, though neither minded. They had never done it before. We feel young, she said, the paint streaming down both of them like rain on a window. We don't look old yet, not really. He reached for her hand, her long, stained fingers interlocking with his, meeting him halfway. Outside, unseen, the web trembled. A silent monitoring they never knew was there.